We treat the high-altitude weather balloon networks and atmospheric monitoring arrays as harmless scientific endeavors, lightweight configurations of latex, sensors, and low-power transmitters drifting passively through the stratosphere to send back clean updates on pressure, temperature, and wind speed. We assume that the upper atmosphere is an empty, desolate void, an unpopulated cushion of near vacuum separating our civilization from the harsh radiation of deep space. But the stratosphere is not empty. It is a highly sensitive electromagnetic shoreline, a massive thermodynamic membrane where the Earth's magnetosphere frictionally rubs against the solar winds. If you run an automated high-altitude research station on an isolated ridge in the frozen expanses of northern Alaska for 40 years, tracking the upper atmospheric telemetry, the system eventually stops just recording the weather. It begins to intercept a different layer of data. The thin air hardens into a reflective mirror, turning the horizon into a massive storage medium that begins to remanifest old atmospheric tests, forgotten radio experiments, and anomalies that should have dissolved into space decades ago. My name is Nicholas, and for 13 years I worked as a senior stratospheric data analyst for a global environmental intelligence collective. My specialization was high-altitude frequency clutter. My job was located at Station Echo Tracer, a heavily reinforced, dome-shaped monitoring outpost anchored directly to the jagged permafrost of a remote ridge in the Brooks Range of northern Alaska. The station was equipped with a high-power, tropospheric scatter antenna array and a continuous launch system for automated, sensor-heavy weather balloons that floated 20 miles above the Earth, skimming the very edge of the mesosphere. Living inside a localized research dome in the Arctic winter is a masterclass in absolute sensory deprivation. The world outside is a frozen, howling desert of white ice and black rock, plunged into months of permanent polar night where the temperature regularly drops below -50 degrees Celsius. The only sound inside the facility was the constant, industrial whine of the hydrogen gas generators filling the balloon envelopes, mixed with the low, hypnotic 60 Hz hum of the massive mainframe computers processing the incoming data packets. You learn to rely entirely on the visual interfaces. You train your eyes to watch the rolling green waterfall displays of the spectrum analyzers, looking for a clean, stable telemetry stream from the balloons drifting silently across the polar horizon. It was during a blinding, high-altitude solar storm in early January when the stratospheric sensors captured the loop. The time was exactly 3:14 in the morning. I was tracking a newly launched research balloon at an altitude of 110,000 feet when the primary telemetry monitor on my central console experienced a sudden, total structural inversion. The scrolling, multicolored lines representing atmospheric ozone density, cosmic ray counts, and wind shear instantly flattened into a single, perfectly level violet line that pulsed across the screen. I immediately initiated a system override, assuming that the intense solar radiation had overloaded the balloon's unshielded payload circuitry. As the diagnostic software forced a hard reboot of the ground station receiver, the raw audio monitor from the high-frequency radio array automatically routed itself to my headphones. The high-altitude channels normally produce a soft, comforting hiss, a vast sea of cosmic white noise mixed with the distant, polite crackle of shortwave radio reflections from the lower atmosphere. But my headphones didn't produce a hiss. They returned an absolute, freezing silence that felt heavy enough to freeze the blood in my veins. I advanced the master volume control on my mixing console to its absolute maximum setting. Out of the deep acoustic vacuum of the stratosphere, a vocal signal began to organize itself. It wasn't a transmission from a commercial airliner, and it wasn't an auroral interference pattern. It was a flat, rhythmic, and perfectly measured sequence of geographic coordinates and personal identification codes, read aloud by a man whose vocal print was an exact, flawless acoustic duplication of my own voice. The delivery was entirely mechanical, stripped of any natural human cadence, warmth, or inflection, repeating a sequence of numbers that matched my exact date of birth, my social security number, and the precise coordinates of the chair I was sitting in. Analyst Nicholas logged into Terminal 4. Atmospheric density 0. The static horizon is locked. Prepare the ground station for equalization. Before I could unclip my headset and alert the facility director via the emergency landline, my secondary monitor cleared itself of the meteorological software interface. The standard corporate telemetry layout vanished entirely, replaced by a monochrome system console that began compiling lines of historical text at an impossible speed. The text wasn't standard software code or weather data. It was an exhaustive, chronological log of every high-altitude military pilot, aerospace surveyor, and experimental balloonist who had vanished into the upper atmosphere over the Arctic Circle since the late 1940s. It listed forgotten Cold War espionage flights, missing supersonic test pilots, and civilian meteorologists whose tracking signals had suddenly cut out without a trace. The final entry on the rapidly compiling list was dated with the current calendar day, and it displayed my own full name, my employee index, and a real-time biometric feed of my accelerating pulse. The main intercom unit on the insulated wall next to my desk suddenly erupted with a sharp, distorted burst of high-voltage static that made me jump out of my chair. It was the voice of Benjamin, the facility's night shift mechanical engineer who was monitoring the balloon launch bay on the lower level. His voice was completely stripped of its usual professional calm, replaced by a raw, breathless panic that vibrated through the small control room. He told me to look through the primary reinforced observation dome toward the northern horizon. I stood up from my desk, walking over to the thick, multi-layered plexiglass dome that looked out into the Arctic night. The space outside should have been a chaotic blur of blowing snow, pitch-black mountain peaks, and the faint, green ribbons of the natural northern lights. Instead, the blizzard had fallen perfectly still. The driving snow didn't hit the structure. The flakes seemed to freeze suspended in midair, forming a dense, unmoving galaxy of ice crystals around the station. But the true horror was the coloration of the sky. Illuminated by an unknown source from the upper atmosphere, the entire northern horizon wasn't dark. It was glowing with a brilliant, intense and unnatural violet luminescence that seemed to be bleeding downward from the edge of space. The light wasn't static. It was shifting in slow, geometric currents that resembled the patterns of a cold solar nebula, casting long, frantic purple shadows across the frozen ridges of the Brooks Range. And hanging perfectly still in the center of the glowing sky, completely unaffected by the 90-knot jet stream winds, was a structure. It looked like a massive, geometric core composed of raw violet silicon crystal, its surface carved with millions of shifting, microscopic lines of data that matched the missing person's logs compiling on my monitors. The material was pulsing subtly, expanding and contracting in perfect synchronization with a low-frequency seismic vibration that was registering on our station's microbarometers at exactly 3 Hz. Suddenly, the mechanical systems of Station Echo Tracer erupted into a chaotic sequence of structural failures. The massive automated hydrogen gas valves, the heavy machinery used to fill the balloon envelopes, began to operate on their own logic. The heavy steel regulators shrieked as the computers forced the system to vent gas in a series of rhythmic pulses that matched the 3 Hz vibration. The primary diesel generators powering our life support systems cut out simultaneously, plunging the entire facility into absolute darkness save for the intense purple radiance flooding through the observation dome. From the speaker of the primary telemetry console, a sound began to rise. It wasn't a mechanical noise, and it wasn't the sound of the wind. It was a collective, multi-layered vocal harmonic, a wall of thousands of human voices singing a flat, microtonal chord that carried no melody and no emotion. The voices weren't shouting for help, and they weren't screaming in agony. They sounded perfectly hollow, like an automated choir constructed out of old shortwave radio static and long-forgotten radar echoes, their collective breath vibrating through the aluminum framework of my control desk. I looked back through the observation dome into the violet light of the sky. Descending slowly through the glowing atmospheric curtain, completely silent and unaffected by the laws of gravity, were the physical remains of the missing aircraft and research payloads from the historical logs. I could see the rusted, frost-encrusted wings of Cold War spy planes, the silver spheres of early experimental balloons, and the shattered cockpits of modern supersonic jets, all drifting downward toward the mountain ridge like a procession of ghosts descending into a graveyard. Their engines weren't spinning. Their instrument panels were burning with that same cold violet luminescence, and their cockpit windows showed the silhouettes of crews sitting perfectly upright, their faces turned toward our station. The descending core didn't strike the dome. The moment the bottom of the geometric crystal breached the radius of our tropospheric antenna array, the physical gravity inside the operations room completely collapsed. I didn't fall down toward the floor. My body was lifted smoothly into the freezing, dry air of the pod, my headset cable snapping as I was pulled upward toward the ceiling. The massive 20-ton computer console, the metal server racks, and the heavy equipment logs were lifting out of their mountings alongside me, breaking apart into millions of floating fragments that drifted through the violet light like industrial space debris. The transition didn't hurt. I didn't feel the sensation of freezing, and I didn't feel my lungs fail. My consciousness was simply pulled apart into thousands of parallel data streams, my personal memories of the lower world, my atmospheric career, and my name converted into a cold, binary code sequence that was instantly absorbed into the shifting patterns of the descending core. When I finally opened my eyes, the frozen Arctic ridge was gone. I was sitting perfectly upright at my desk inside the telemetry pod. The bright, artificial white light of the mainframe modules was streaming through the glass windows, casting a clean, sterile light across my monitors. The screens were bright green, showing a completely normal, stable stratospheric log for the 90,000-foot balloon layer. The sensors were operating smoothly, their tracking indicators perfectly aligned with the corporate timeline. The solar storm had passed. The shift was over. The relief crew arrived at 7 o'clock carrying their travel mugs and talking about the morning weather report as they took over the logging terminals. The automated data logs showed an absolutely flawless, uninterrupted night of atmospheric monitoring, without a single frequency fluctuation, structural alarm, or communication error. The company physicians told me I had experienced an acute episode of high-latitude, high-frequency vertigo, a temporary cognitive distortion known to happen to data analysts who spend long hours isolated in dark rooms, watching the repetitive, high-contrast rotation of spectrum screens and listening to the continuous low-frequency hum of high-voltage computers in the polar night. They signed me off for a mandatory 1-month shore leave, flew me back to the mainland on the corporate transport plane, and assured me that my standing with the collective was completely unblemished. I try to believe their logical medical explanations. I live in a small, isolated cabin in the deep, landlocked valleys of the Great Smoky Mountains, as far from horizons, radar stations, and flight paths as the geography of the country will allow. I live in a dense, forested environment where there are no wide skis, no open plains, and no radios, spending my days watching the forest floor. But 3 days ago, I looked up through a small clearing in the trees at mid-afternoon. A single weather balloon was drifting miles above, its silver envelope catching the bright sunlight against the blue expanse. As I watched the silver dot, it didn't drift with the wind. The shape began to expand its geometric outline, its surface smoothing out into a perfect, absolute violet mirror that stretched across the sky from horizon to horizon. And as the sun began to set behind the ridges, casting long shadows across the valley, the sky didn't turn orange or pink under the light. It began to glow with a brilliant, cold violet luminescence that cast a faint, geometric pattern of telemetry grids across the wood of my patio. And if I sit perfectly still in the quiet of the mountain evening, I can hear the soft, faint, microtonal chord of thousands of hollow voices singing from deep within the upper atmosphere, reading my name, my employee identification number, and my current geographical coordinates over and over again. The array didn't stay in Alaska. The static horizon is open, and they are just waiting for the network to equalize.